And in Revelation chapter 6, the first thing that you should understand, it's a response. Chapter 6 is a response to what happens in chapters 4 and 5. It's really a culmination of all of the ages and of all of human history to get to this point where Jesus Christ takes the scroll from the hand of the Father. This scroll, which represents the authority and the power to enact God's will on earth, His ownership of everything, of all created things, and to bring about restoration and righteousness is really what that scroll represents. And as He begins to open the scroll, things begin to happen on the earth. And so the picture that you have in heaven in Revelation chapters 4 and 5, the view turns around and then it turns and it has a view of what's happening on the earth because Jesus takes the scroll. There's a series of judgments that begin to happen, and they're represented as the scroll or seal judgments, right? As the seals are broken on this scroll and it begins to open up, things are happening on the earth. Each time a seal is broken and opened, it represents a specific judgment that happens on the earth. And just for context, if you look at Revelation chapter 6 and verse 15, I think this is the focus of the judgments from the scroll judgments. When the seals are broken, the focus is on the people mentioned in Revelation chapter 6 and verse 15, the kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong. You have this context where what's going to happen is going to shake the whole earth. It's going to change the way of life for everybody living on the earth, but really with a specific focus on the kings of the earth. And the kings of the earth are going to be probably the most greatly affected. And here's how. Look at Psalm. We're going to take a minute. We're going to go through and just kind of remind ourselves about the history of the world in relationship to what God has been doing on the earth. Psalm 2. And it really, again, we've looked at it in the past, and it's a great reminder about God's relationship with the kings of the earth. So we'll read it and take a look here. Psalm 2, starting in verse 1, asks a question: why are the nations, why do they rage? And why do the peoples meditate on vain things? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against Yahweh and against His anointed, saying, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. And so that picture that you have in the first two verses is really a historical picture of the kings of the earth. This represents their attitude towards Yahweh and towards His anointed. Right? We learned a little bit this morning, right, that authority, when God has all authority, and He's given all of that authority to Jesus Christ. And yet, the authorities that exist on the earth, the governing authorities, like Romans 13:1 would say, they've all been established by God. They've all been set in place by God. But their attitude about it is not to give thanks or to recognize His authority, but to want to throw it off. Right? So that's the attitude of the kings of the earth. This is just to set some context, right? We know that by and large, the kings of the earth, the governing authorities on the earth, are not recognizing God's hand in their lives, and they try to live and exert their own authority apart from His. And that's just a fact of the governing kings of the earth. If you remember from the book of Daniel, when Nebuchadnezzar had to have a little reminder about who gave him his authority, and he had to bark like a dog for a few years until he recognized that his authority came from God. So even the rulers of the earth, and Isaiah would remind us that God holds the rulers of the earth in His hand, and He can move them back and forth simply like you would water in the palm of your hand. It's not a problem for Him. But he has allowed the kings of the earth to take that stand. And so that's when it says in Psalm chapter 2 and verse 4 that he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord mocks them. And then he speaks to them in his anger. And he terrifies them in his fury, saying, but as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. And so God has promised to establish Jesus Christ as king over the nations. And chapter 6 really represents the beginning of that establishing of the authority and power of Jesus Christ on the earth over and above the kings of the earth. And so what happens is that you have this picture of God who is going to take back the earth. He's going to take back the authority and the dominion that he has, that they have taken from him, or, tried to cast off his authority from them and operate on their own power, right? Historically, God has always determined the habitations and the boundaries and the appointed times of every kingdom on the earth, right? Acts 17 verse 26 says that's what he did. He made from one every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, and he determined their appointed times, when each kingdom would rise up in power, when they would rule, when the next one would come up. He determines their boundaries, the borders, right? There's always disputes over borders. God determines that, right? Where people are going to live. And a part of it is he did that back in Genesis. And so the history of the nations of mankind really go all the way back to the book of Genesis. And he had commanded Adam and Eve, even from Genesis 1:28, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, scatter themselves, right? Fill and have children that would scatter themselves across the earth and exercise dominion over the earth. And he had given Noah the very same command as he did Adam and Eve when Noah begins to repopulate the earth in Genesis 9:7. He is to be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly, and live in it. And so that's always been God's desire for mankind to establish themselves in the form of nations, in the form of different boundaries. And he designed it that way. And it was their command. The only problem is mankind did not want to obey God in the establishing of the nations. You have to recognize this. Right away in Genesis, they said, no, let us cast off our fetters from us, and we're going to do what we want. We're going to have one government and one nation, and we're going to stay together in one place. They called it Babel, right? And so when they wanted to stay together in one place, that was a resistance to the establishing of the nations of the earth, the way God had designed it. That's a part of the whole plan of God. And so when they would say in Genesis 11:4, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name, right? We don't want to do it God's way. We want to do it our own way and establish a name for ourselves. And so it was a one world government that was in view there, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth, right? They did not want to scatter over the whole face of the earth. And so God has to push them out to the appointed places and times which he had predetermined for them. Again, Acts 17. So that's a picture of what would happen, right? What happens in the history of the nations and how God wanted them to exist. In fact, he established for himself one nation from a person, Abraham. And if you remember the promise that he gave to Abraham, he said, I'm going to make from you one nation. You're going to go out and you're going to become a nation, the nation of Israel. He says, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And in you then, through you, in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. That is, the nation of Israel was really designed to reach and to be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. Ultimately, that's fulfilled through Jesus Christ. And ultimately, that happens as he's the appointed one who would rule over the nations. He would bring salvation and righteousness to the nations. It talks about it, and one last kind of reference is that a promise of God is that he's going to, in the future, bring about this salvation to the nations. And he's going to do it this way in Isaiah 49:6. And so, in Isaiah 49:6, it says, he asked the question, is it too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob? Here's a reference to Christ coming back, and in the future, he's going to fulfill his promises to Israel. He's going to raise up the tribes of Jacob, and he's going to restore the preserved ones of Israel. And so, throughout the age of the church, there are preserved ones of Israel. God knows who they are. We have no idea. There's no genealogies that exist today to identify them, but God knows. And he says, Christ is going to come back and restore the preserved ones of Israel, and I will also make you a light of the nations, so that my salvation may reach the end of the earth. And that happens throughout the history of the church, and it's going to happen in the future as God begins to restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back his preserved ones. There is going to be a salvation that reaches to the ends of the earth through Israel. And yet, when we get to Revelation chapter 6, by way of a long introduction, we're seeing how God begins the activity of restoring the rule of Jesus Christ to the nations of the world. That's really what's in focus here. As the seals are broken on the scroll in Revelation chapter 5, and it begins to describe each one of those seals, what happens when they break, it's really all about restoring Jesus Christ's rule, or establishing Jesus Christ's rule over the nations. Now, in order to do that, he's going to take away their false notions of peace and security and safety that they think they have as they establish it for themselves, right? The nations of the world feel pretty comfortable in the authority and the power that they have, and they don't think there's any need to bow the knee to Christ. And so he's just going to take that power and authority away from them and allow them to live in fear and insecurity. And that's really what the seal judgments represent. God is going to wipe out the geopolitical establishment of the earth, and he's going to take it all away from them. And he does so starting in Revelation chapter 6 and verse 1. So we read there, and it says, I saw, and I looked, when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, then I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying as with a voice of thunder, Come. So, for the setting, John has been in heaven. He has been transported in a vision to see and interact with this throne room vision where Jesus Christ has now taken the scroll, and it says he opened one of the 7 seals. 6 more to go, but one of the 7 seals are opened, and with that, he's invited to look at what happens. Right? He's able to look at what happens when this seal is opened. So John looks in verse 2, and it says, I looked, and behold, a white horse. Now here is the part where he's looking at this vision, and he's looking at what's happening, and the representation there is a white horse is what he sees. And he who sits on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went about overcoming and to overcome. And so, this is the first seal that is broken, and the first seal that broken is really, sometimes they call it this, and it kind of fits, they call this the false peace, right? There is a activity on the earth represented by this horse, and the figure on the horse, and this white horse, and it says that he went about overcoming and to overcome. And another way to look at this temporary peace or false peace that exists, it's a consolidation of power. He's just taking in whatever authorities are resisting, he's able to overcome that and bring it all together under one power. And yet he does this without going to war. He does this without having to use, as it shows, the bow. He's described as having 2 things, right? He has a bow. It's a symbol of attacking power. It's something you would use to strike your enemies with, right? the ability to wage war. And yet it says he's holding the bow, but it really doesn't describe him as using the bow. It's just the threat of the bow. And it seems that the threat of the bow is enough. The threat of, if you don't listen, this is what will happen, is enough to get them in line. And so there's submission to this threat. He's consolidating power because the other symbol that's given to him there in verse 2 is that he had a bow and he had a crown. And so he has this crown that represents the authority or power given to him, the ability to govern and rule. And so with the bow and the threat of the bow, he goes about overcoming and to overcome. And this is indicative of what was predicted in the future times, right? It's a warning about this kind of false security, right? He's consolidating power. He's bringing about order in the world through this threat of power and through the authority given to him through this crown. And he's able to do this. But look for a minute, some of the descriptions that they have about this. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, and says, verse 2, right, starting in verse 1, really, it says that about the times and the seasons, brothers, you have no need of anyone to be written to you, for you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. And now here's the description of the beginning of it, right? When people start to say peace and safety, you should not be comforted and secured by this. You should be worried about it. That should worry you. Because it says, then destruction will come upon them suddenly, like labor pains, like a woman who is pregnant, and then they will never escape. So this is a false sense of security that's given through this false peace that's brought about as he overcomes and he conquers without really having to conquer. He's able to consolidate power with the sense and probably the proclamation of peace and safety. I'm going to take care of you, right? This power and authority that comes about is to disarm the people of the world, the nations of the world, to cause them not to worry. This is probably the kind of thing like, hey, you don't need your guns because I have all the guns and you don't need them. So I'll take care of you. I have the bow. You don't need it. Okay? But it's a false sense of security. Jeremiah 6:14 says, look, when they have healed the brokenness of my people, superficially saying peace, peace, but really there's no peace. Right? There's a false sense, a false kind of peace that really is, I want to control things, and you don't get to. And in Ezekiel 13:10 says, it's when they have misled my people by saying peace, when there is no peace, and everyone builds a wall, behold, they plaster over it with whitewash. It's really no security at all. It's just a broken wall, but you can't tell. We plastered it up. So you have this false sense of peace and security that comes at the beginning of this 7-year period of tribulation as the first seal is broken. You got to remember there's probably a great amount of chaos as there are missing people across the world, and there are things that are happened that just cause them to worry. And this authority that comes in, God says, I'm going to break this seal, and I'm going to kind of rewrite the powers and authorities that exist and establish this new style of government. And it's going to bring people a false sense of security. Oh, we really don't have to worry at all, except until the second seal is broken. So God kind of gives them and allows them to have this false sense of security from this new form of government that overcomes all the other governments. And that's the picture that you get there in Revelation chapter 6 and verse 1 with the first seal. So their anxiety and their fear, they're somewhat going, well, maybe there's nothing to really worry about. Maybe everything's going to be okay. Maybe this new government that comes in will provide the security that we need. Revelation chapter 6 and verse 3, and then he broke the second seal. And it all goes out the window. So the second seal is broken. And these first four seals that represent, they call them at times the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and other names that they've been given throughout history. But they do work as a team. They work together to establish God's beginning of judgments on the face of the earth. And so it says in Revelation chapter 6 and verse 3, when he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, come. And then another, a red horse, went out, and to him who sits on it, it was given for him to take away that peace from the earth. And so it only lasts a short time anyway. And very quickly, the next horse comes as the second seal is broken, and the peace is taken away from the earth. And it says that men would slay one another, and a great sword was given to him. And so what happens is that this false sense of security quickly breaks out into anarchy and chaos. And it just says men would just go out and slay one another. I look at this as kind of great rioting and great disruption of the peace. And it's not necessarily one nation going to war against another, because we don't have that situation anymore. It's mass rioting and anarchy and chaos that take place. The peace that was consolidated in power was now taken away. The first seal that deluded them into thinking that they were secure is gone, and now there is death on a massive scale where people are rising up and killing one another in this chaotic time. Men attacking and killing men. You know, before the time of the tribulation, before it would come, Jesus had taught in the Olivet Discourse, right, that there would be wars and rumors of wars, and you're going to see a little bit of instability, and you're going to, cause people to worry. But this is different. This is different. This is just a massive amount of death being brought about through the second seal. The security that they had is gone. Let's just add to it and look at this as a big picture, and we're going to look at the third seal as well. So if you're in Revelation 6, verse 5, the third seal is opened. And when the third seal is opened, I heard the third living creature saying, come. So you have this marking that, it's kind of curious, each one of these judgments is attached to one of the living creatures in the throne room. Right? The first living creature says come when the first seal is broken. The second living creature gets to announce the second one. The third living creature gets to announce the third one. And so, the third, as it says, when he opened the third living seal, I heard the third living creature saying, come, and I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sits on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And, so you have this, and it says, when he has the pair of scales in his hand, I heard as it were a voice in the center of the four living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine. And so what you have now is economic upheaval. You've had political upheaval with this false sense of security through the consolidation of power. You have mass killings and riots taking place, and as a result of this, think about just a few years ago with the COVID, the supply chain is now in jeopardy, right? We know it can happen pretty quickly because we've seen little versions of it. And this is what happens, is that just the economy is now affected, where everything that you could afford now you can't afford. You can't afford the very basic necessities of wheat and barley. You can't afford the ingredients to make bread. And again, the modern equivalent is just the supply chain now is broken, right? The rioting has gone out on the face of the earth, and now nobody can get anything. It didn't take very long, but a day or two, really, of the COVID lockdown for all the grocery stores to empty out. And if you remember, that you just went in and there was nothing there, right? Other countries have experienced that for decades, right? In communist Russia, it was common for them. You would have to line up at the grocery store before it opened, and when you went in, maybe one aisle out of the 10 aisles would be filled, and it was filled with whatever they could get in that day. You didn't know. You just went in to buy whatever they had because you didn't know what they were going to have. Beyond that, you have the difficulty of people who live beyond the grocery stores, right? I mean, you have people who have to live in subsistence around the farms or around what they can provide for themselves. But by and large, it's going to be the modern cities and the modern people who are going to be affected by this the most, because the joke is, you ask your children, where does food come from? When they do, I don't know, the grocery store. They don't know where it comes from, right? So if they don't know how to go to the store, they don't know how to get it. And God has taken away the peace. He has taken now and allowed the killing unrestrained, and now he's allowed the supply chain to disappear. And the economic upheaval is that Now there's no sense of economic security. You have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow with your food. You don't know where you're going to get it. So you see a picture building here with these seals being opened. He takes all the things that mankind thought they could trust in, and they could ask their government to provide for them. They can no longer provide for them, right? FEMA can't come in and stop this one. You can't apply for assistance that's going to come in and save you from these seal judgments. The governments of the earth have no ability to solve these problems anymore. And that's what really, I think, again, the representation of these seal judgments is an attack on the kings of the earth and God taking away any ability for them to provide for people and to provide for the world through a government system of the nations. It doesn't work anymore. He's stripping it all out. This is what God is doing with these seal judgments. Now, Revelation chapter 6 and verse 7 says it this way, and he opened the fourth seal. This is the last one we'll be able to look at tonight. And he heard a voice of the fourth living creature saying, "Come." And so the fourth living creature invites him to look at what happens when the fourth seal is opened. And it's described this way in verse 8. "I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and he who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him. Authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and fourthly, the wild beasts of the earth." So you have this last phase of God stripping away any security that the nations and the kings of the world could provide for anybody through wide-scale death and destruction. And he describes it very simply. He had four categories that God says, I've given him authority in these four categories, and authority over the authority is over a fourth of the earth. Now, does anybody happen to know the population of the earth as it exists today? It's about 8 billion people. Divide that by 25%, and you get the idea of the wide-scale death that's going to happen very quickly in the first part of the 7 years, as this authority is given to these four horsemen to disrupt all power and authority on the earth. 2 billion people, by a current estimate, would die if this were to happen and they were to exist. 2 billion people would die in the matter of a few years. And so, how do they have authority and power? God has given them authority and power to kill a fourth of the earth and to take their life through the sword, that is, through war, law enforcement. When the mass killings start and you want to put down and you want to try to stabilize things, you're going to send out your law enforcement to kill even more people. And so they're going to send out the sword. Through famine, many people will die. If you have any recollection of history, in the last 100 years, there have been a couple of great famines across the earth. One in Russia, and one in China. The one in China, through Mao, and establishing the communist regime there, they would estimate that anywhere between 2 and 5 million people died in a matter of years through famine. When you didn't want to submit to communist Mao, he just stopped growing any food. He just starved them out by literally not growing any food in the farms, and 2 to 5 million people died. So famine is real, and famine can kill a lot of people in a hurry. Pestilence and disease is easy. Again, as I mentioned, even the false threat of COVID gets people afraid to think that millions and millions of people are dying across the world when they didn't. But in this case, they will. Here will be the real thing. And if you go back again in your history and you just want to know, how can disease kill people, go back to the Dark Ages in Europe and talk about the bubonic plague. 25 to 50% of the European population was wiped out. That was just in one place on the earth. And in one place on the earth, that represented about 50 million people who died through the bubonic plague in Europe alone. And then the last category that he gives is probably the most interesting, wild beasts, right? God's instrument of judgment is going to be the animal kingdom rising up against mankind. If you remember in Genesis when he said, I want you to go out across the face of the earth to exercise dominion over the animal kingdom. It's gone now. You don't get to exercise dominion over the animal kingdom. The animal kingdom is going to exercise dominion over you. And so he's going to allow wild beasts to rise up and kill, as a part of all of this, a fourth of mankind. They're going to be involved in it. You're not just going to worry about coyotes coming in and to Dearborn and, disrupting your life a little bit and making it uncomfortable to take your trash out or watch your kitty at night. But they're going to want to not just take your kitty, they're going to want to kill you. And so this is a part of God's judgment in the whole thing, right? God is going to allow the animal kingdom to rise up, and mankind will no longer have dominion over the animal kingdom, but it will have dominion over them. Lions and snakes and any kind of attacks that will kill people. These are the judgments that will cause mankind to live in fear and anxiety and have all security stripped away from them, so they won't have any idea what to do next. This is how God begins the judgments on the world in order to establish the true authority of Jesus Christ, as he strips away all the authorities in the earth and strips away all their power and their ability to take care of mankind. It's all gone. That's what happens in the first four judgments as the seals are broken. Mankind cannot just say, we're not going to listen, we're going to do things for ourselves, and we're going to take care of ourselves, because God takes it all away from them. To where they're afraid to go out of their doors at night, maybe an animal will come and kill me if I take the trash out. So this is the picture that you have in the first four judgments, the first four seals. There are a few more to go. We'll get into that. But again, part of it is that who responds to it, and the focus, like in Revelation 6:15, is the kings of the earth, the great men, and the commanders. That's the main focus in the picture. Now everybody is worried about it, and they have to run into caves to hide themselves because things are so bad. But they no longer have any power or authority to provide security or food or protection or benefit to anybody on the earth. God has taken it all away in these four judgments. Any stability that existed will not exist. NATO will not be able to stop anything. They can hardly do anything now. There's no Axis and allies. There's no good guy and bad guy. It's all just bad at this point. And you don't have anything to trust in. This is the power and glory of God as he displays his ability to strip these things from the earth. God has predicted these things, and they are surely going to come to pass. They are going to accomplish all of his good purpose, both to judge the wicked and to save the righteous. And what will be left will also, we're going to just talk for a minute in concluding here, that as God strips away all the power and authority of the earth, there's another person who wants to take the opportunity when it exists to take it for himself. God's going to strip it away because that's what God wants to happen. But, as politicians in our modern time will say, never waste an opportunity. And so there will be one coming who will take opportunity in the vacuum of power on the earth to try to establish his own. Look at Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7. While God has his purpose and he's going to accomplish his good purpose, there's another person willing to take advantage of it. I gotta turn to my Bible and talk at the same time. There we go. And starting in verse 23 of Daniel chapter 7, talking about this last kingdom of the earth, the last power and authority on the earth. It's going to be different than all the other kingdoms, as it talks about there in verse 23. And is going to devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. There's a picture of the future end of that kingdom, right? It says there were 10 horns or 10 powers that were established out of this last kingdom on the earth that will exist when he comes back. It says, and then there was another, a different one in verse 24. Another will arise after them, and he's going to be different from the previous ones. He's going to make low 3 kings. He's going to consolidate power, similar to what we see. But he's going to speak words against the Most High. This is his opportunity. Verse 25. He will speak words against the Most High and wear down the saints of the Highest One. And he will intend to make changes in seasons and law. And they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. And so you have this picture of the first, either the 3.5 years. This 3.5 year time in which he's going to take advantage of the vacuum of power and the disruption and the chaos and the fear to accomplish his own purpose. He's going to demand to be worshipped. He's going to set himself up. But in the end, as it says in verse 26, a court will sit in judgment and his dominion will be taken away and annihilated and destroyed forever. Then, verse 27, the reign and dominion of the great and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest ones. The highest one. And his kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. So this is the stripping away and this disruption of all the kings of the earth in order to establish the kingdom of Jesus Christ. But in the meantime, and in the middle of it, Antichrist, the little horn, the little power, is going to come and establish the one world government, and he's going to fill the gap, and he's going to try to accomplish his purpose at the same time. Guess who's going to win? So we know who's going to win. Daniel tells us, and we already know, the promise is certain and the victory is secure. But we see the picture there about power and authority on the earth, even from Daniel. And we see that opportunity is going to come as God strips away power and authority from mankind. It'll be consolidated by one person. One, the Antichrist. The Antichrist. So we'll pick that up and understand, but only God could accomplish this, right? Remember, just like Joseph, what you mean for evil, God can accomplish good. He'll accomplish and establish his good power and will through it. So both can be true. God is doing what he wants, and it will open up opportunity for him, and he'll allow the Antichrist to do for a temporary time, what he wants. But ultimately, Christ will come and have the victory. But this is how it starts. This is how it begins, with the first 4 seals being broken and opening up and affecting the power and authority structures on the earth and causing great disruption and death. So with that, we'll close our time. We'll finish chapter 6 as we move along and look at the other seals. And we get this picture about what's going to happen on the earth as these judgments begin. We'll pray. Father, we thank you for this night, and it's a terrifying picture, really a horrific picture of what's going to happen on the earth. But it's no worse than today as the governments and the powers of the world reject your authority and reject submitting to your King. And so we say, come, Lord Jesus, come. And we want to see the seals broken, and we want to see the earth taken back, even though it will cause great devastation. God will judge the wicked, and he will save the righteous. And we look forward to that day, knowing what it's going to be like. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.